So one has to wonder then, if they don't want to be seen as being in the pockets or handing a win to the bank, then why make the amendments that stifled the innovation? Certainly with respect to the point that was raised around passing on yield or paying yield on stablecoin, for example. So expanding that beyond what was in the Genius Act. So why create the problem in the first place would be my question. So it just seems a bit nonsensical in many ways that on the one hand, you don't want to, well, I guess it's perception, right? So maybe they are on the side of the banks, but they just don't want to be seen as being on the side of the banks. Maybe that's what this is, right? Maybe I've answered my own question. Who knows? Okay, so the Clarity Act is dead. So we're just reacting to a video from Coin Bureau, really good channel for anybody who's interested in crypto. So I'll leave a link to the channel and you can watch the original video there. But I just wanted to go through this and share my thoughts with respect to this news that came out quite recently. So not too long ago, I covered the Clarity Act as well as the Genius Act, which at the time appeared to be quite positive and bullish with respect to the crypto industry. And the idea was that it was going to bring clarity, which is the idea without the Clarity Act. And the Genius Act was focusing on stablecoin essentially, and basically creating a regulatory environment, which meant that potentially there was more clarity around the rules around issuing of stablecoins, and allowing people to basically, or new entrants to come into the space and positioning the stablecoin, the USD stablecoin more specifically, as the central currency with respect to the crypto industry. Whilst the Clarity Act was intended to provide more clarity with respect to other alternative crypto assets, enabling then other participants, and more specifically institutional participants, to enter into the space. So the news regarding the fact that the Clarity Act, despite the fact it looked so promising, and despite the fact a lot of people within the crypto space and a lot of the main participants in this space were for it until apparently the 11th hour, is quite an interesting turn of events. So let's have a look at what Coin Bureau has to say about this, and take it from there.
The holy grail of US crypto regulation was just hours away from a historic vote. For years, we've been told that regulatory clarity was the missing piece of the puzzle, the one thing holding back the tidal wave of institutional capital.
And that's true. So there was a lot of hype and expectation around this. It's part of the reason why a lot of crypto projects and a lot of crypto companies, such as Kraken, for example, Coinbase, which is mentioned in the title of this video by Coin Bureau, was so heavily behind Trump and the Trump campaign to come into the White House, and why there was a lot of positivity around these bills initially. So it was viewed by many in the crypto space as a very bullish sign and a very bullish position. And the hope was that obviously anyone with crypto holdings and anyone trading crypto would see the benefit of that in the short and medium term, just based on the improved sentiment around the crypto industry, with the Trump administration obviously winning the election and coming into power.
But then the industry itself pulled the plug. In a twist that few saw coming, one of the biggest players in crypto looked at the bill they'd spent millions of dollars lobbying for and said, no thanks.
So to be clear, it wasn't the entire industry. He only mentioned Coinbase there, but Coinbase is a massive participant in this space. It's probably the one most people will have heard of in terms of those that are sort of casual or not sort of very familiar with crypto, and it's the one that has the most advertising and marketing. So there will be others, such as Kraken, which I mentioned, but it was really Coinbase that kind of torpedoed the whole thing, even though they had been one of the biggest advocates for this particular Clarity Act, or this piece of regulation. So again, it's just interesting that they just decided pretty much at the 11th hour to basically, as I say, torpedo the whole thing. So it'd be interesting to figure out here what has gone on.
Did the banks sabotage the bill? Did the politicians try to slip in a Trojan horse? Or did the crypto industry just realize that clarity came at a price they weren't willing to pay? This is the story of how Washington almost codified a catastrophe and why the regulatory vacuum might be here to stay. So, to understand why this collapse is such a big deal, we first have to set the stage. We're in January 2026. The crypto market has been holding its breath for the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act, or just the Clarity Act. After the Genius Act was signed into law last year, which finally gave us a framework for payment stablecoins, the Clarity Act was supposed to be the big one.
And that's a reasonable expectation, and it was certainly the expectation I had, because obviously the two kind of, well, it's not obvious, but if you're somebody that's in this space, in the crypto space, the two go hand in hand, because stablecoin is basically pseudocurrency in a sense. It's meant to be a one-to-one peg, in this case to the US dollar, and therefore it's only one classification of cryptocurrency, I should say, rather than an asset. But then you've got other digitized versions of assets on the blockchain as well, and commodities, and also derivatives as well. And this area has basically not been addressed at all by the Genius Act. So basically the two were needed to create this complete governance and regulatory framework that addressed all forms and types of crypto assets. So this sort of situation we're in, where we have, I suppose, some sort of clarity in one space, i.e. stablecoin, versus, a lack of clarity, so to speak, with respect to every other crypto asset, is not helpful. So as I say, the reasonable expectation would have been, with phase one, i.e. the Genius Act being delivered, one would expect phase two, i.e. the Clarity Act, although it being a lot bigger of an act, to have passed through, considering at the time it also had bipartisan support. So yes, it's interesting that, as I say, it has been torpedoed by a party that sits outside of government, i.e. Coinbase, predominantly.
This was the Market Structure Bill, and the goal was simple: end the turf war between the SEC and the CFTC. For most of the last 5 years, we'd lived in a world where Gary Gensler claimed that everything except Bitcoin was a security. The Clarity Act was supposed to fix that by introducing the concept of a mature blockchain. Basically, if a network could prove it was decentralized, meaning no single person or group controlled more than 20% of the tokens or voting power, then it would be classified as a digital commodity under the jurisdiction of the CFTC rather than the SEC.
Yeah, and this all makes sense, right? Because I think, what, Gary Gensler's position seemed to conveniently ignore is that treating all crypto assets as securities is kind of like, it's a very blunt, or sort of, it's a very clumsy way of treating regulation of crypto, because crypto, like any other sort of financial framework, there's lots of different features and characteristics to whether they're crypto assets or tokens, etc., etc. So then they don't have the same characteristics, is basically what I'm trying to say. So some will be assets in the sense that they may afford you rights to what we would call future cash flows, for example, or they may appreciate. So Bitcoin is a good example of that. In some cases, they're not necessarily an asset, but they basically execute a contract, or they're programmable. So that's where Ethereum comes into it. They may facilitate other functionality, for example. It might just be an NFT. So clearly these things are very, very different, and have different benefits, different features, different characteristics. So as an accountant, for example, you would account for them in different ways because of this, and you'd have to assess them individually as a classes of assets, and decide on the accounting treatment accordingly. So regulation, in my mind, should mirror that, which is why it should be clear which regulatory authority should be dealing with a crypto asset or a crypto token or a crypto derivative or whatever it is, for example. So I think for me, the Clarity Act and the sentiment behind it was definitely the right thing, and it was important that it was clear what the SEC should be looking after, as opposed to what the CFTC should be looking after.
This was the Holy Grail. It meant that truly decentralized crypto projects could finally operate without the constant threat of a Wells notice. Senate Banking Committee Chairman Tim Scott had been working on this for months. The White House wanted it, the crypto industry wanted it. It looked like a done deal. But then came the midnight amendments. Late on Monday night, the 12th of January, just 3 days before the scheduled vote, Senator Scott's office released a 278-page amendment to the bill. Now,
So to do the amendment 3 days before you're expecting to pass it, and it's over 200 pages, is definitely a red flag, to those that are going to be subject to that regulation. I mean, my suspicion is this is not uncommon in the world of US politics, I mean, how naive and silly do they think the likes of Coinbase and Kraken and so on are going to be, or even just the electorate, right? Or even those that are just aware of what's happening here. Because as I say, before these amendments, the bill and the legislation was viewed very, very positively. It was certainly the position I had based on the principles behind it, as I've just described, and why I think it's important to have that clarity, because as I say, crypto tokens and assets, they're different, right? And they serve different purposes, and therefore they have different features, and cannot be treated and governed in the same way. And a clear distinction would be stablecoin versus Bitcoin versus NFT, right? They're clearly three different types of things, and you would treat them differently, and you would view them differently from an investment perspective, from an accounting reporting perspective, and therefore, in my view, from a regulatory perspective. So why bring in these amendments? Why was it necessary? Why not consult? And why do them last minute? And ultimately, if you're a cynic, like I would view myself as, you would just view this as a red flag, and that they're trying to sneak in something in the cover of darkness, which is not going to be in your interest ultimately.
In Washington, they call this a manager's amendment, and it's supposed to be a cleanup of the text.
Yeah, and that would suggest it's a very common thing to do, right? So, as I say, one has to wonder why it was only 3 days before the bill was meant to pass on January the 15th.
Pose and clarifying language. But when the lawyers at Coinbase, Kraken, and A16Z started reading the fine print, they realized this wasn't a cleanup. It was a rewrite, and it was filled with poison pills. The first poison pill was a de facto ban on tokenized equities. Now, for the last year, the narrative for 2026 has been real-world assets. We've been talking about tokenizing stocks, bonds, real estate, and much more besides. Coinbase had publicly stated that their strategy for 2026 involved launching a market for tokenized stocks.
Yeah, and this is a massive thing. And it's something the UK has actually been looking at as well with respect to gilts. So I think they wanted to issue Digit, which is a digital version of gilts, and gilts are basically instruments the government uses to basically raise financing. So it borrows money by issuing gilts, and it's equivalent to what you would call a bond in the private sector. So the fact that this regulation would basically potentially ban these things is very odd, because like I say, it's been a massive thing within the crypto space, and it's been the main thing a lot of crypto projects have been talking about, actually, and I think even in the institutional space as well, having real world representation or pegged digital versions of real contracts, real instruments, security instruments, equity instruments, et cetera, et cetera. And it's certainly something that's happening in the United Arab Emirates as well, where again they're looking at real world assets and digital deeds, property deeds, for example. So this innovation has been really important and really central to the value proposition and the use case of many, many crypto projects, including apparently, Coinbase's strategy here. So the fact that this amendment has come in to basically stifle a lot of that, I find particularly strange, and I do wonder what the motivation would have been to do so other than basically restricting competition between themselves and traditional finance that are currently dealing with these things instead.
But the new text of the Clarity Act effectively said that you cannot trade a token that represents a security on a blockchain. Just think about that. The technology that promises to make markets more efficient, instant, and transparent was about to be banned from touching the stock market. It's a bit like banning the internet from being used for mail because the post office exists.
Yeah, and that's true. And I would agree, because it's like the whole point of a blockchain is that it makes things more transparent, that it makes things more efficient, and it makes things faster. It's inherent to what it is, right? So the fact that you're introducing regulation that stops it being the thing that it is, so as to save potentially an existing financial framework, is anti-competitive. It doesn't help the consumer. It doesn't help innovation. So it entrenches existing legacy systems, legacy frameworks, i.e. the banks, the banking system, traditional finance, as we call it. So it feels as though it's pretending to be one thing, and I think Trojan horse is quite an apt description, which I think he described earlier on, where it's sort of presenting itself as one thing, but actually it's doing something. It's almost doing the complete opposite of the thing it's pretending to do, which is interesting.
But that wasn't even the worst part.
What?
The second poison pill was a direct attack on your wallet and a massive gift to the traditional banks. We know that the banking lobby has long been terrified of stablecoins. Why is that? Well, because right now you can hold USDC or USDT and, on some platforms, earn 4 or 5% yield. Banks hate this because they want you to keep your money in one of their crappy savings accounts earning 0.01% so they can lend it out at 7%.
Yeah, so again, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not untrue, right? And I think for me, I would agree with this sentiment. It's, when you think about the yield you can earn on crypto projects, although there's more risk, to be clear about this, it tends to be a lot higher on average than the yield or interest you can receive with a normal, bank account with a retail bank, essentially, or savings account. And again, that's compounded by the fact that it's going to more of your savings income is going to be exposed to income tax, for example, because they've lowered the thresholds with respect to an ISA savings account, which would ring fence your savings from income tax. So if you have a stablecoin offering where again you can buy or acquire stablecoin, which is pegged to a stable currency, i.e. the US dollar, and it's offering you a yield of say 5%, 4%, which may or may not be higher than the going rate of inflation, for example, clearly that's going to be attractive and offer competition to the retail banking sector and force them to look at their products and think about, okay, well, do we need to offer a better interest rate and be more competitive? So again, regulation that prevents a stablecoin issuer from passing on any interest or any yield clearly harms competition and clearly harms the consumer, which again, if we live in a free market economy, it doesn't align with that ethos and that philosophy as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, it's just a very strange position to take, and one has to view it very, very cynically, unfortunately.
Yeah, so last year we got the Genius Act passed. That was a great piece of legislation for crypto. And now what everyone's working on is called market structure, the non-stablecoin crypto assets. And there's been a ton of hard work. The Senate has been amazing to work with. There's a lot of constituents coming in to offer their opinion, including the crypto industry. And of course, Coinbase has a point of view, although we don't represent the crypto industry. And we saw some draft text midnight on Monday night.
Right.
Our lawyers started looking at it on Tuesday. I was in DC on Wednesday. We started to notice some pretty serious issues in the draft text that we had a concern with, and there didn't appear to be a plan to actually get that fixed coming out of a Senate Banking Committee markup. And so we actually felt like we had an obligation to go out and defend our customers' rights and say, we have some issues here. We were careful not to comment on what the Senate should do in terms of markup or not, but They did decide to postpone it, and so now there's an opportunity for us to come back and chat with the bank CEOs and see what would create a win-win outcome here.
So let's walk through some of those issues and also walk through what is a battle taking place between crypto and maybe classic legacy Wall Street here. And then maybe we get into also just the power and influence that you have, whether you believe you have it or not, because every headline last week about this very bill effectively getting temporarily suspended, or at least was about the withdrawal of support that from you, effectively. So you do have more influence maybe than you think. But let's talk about the issues themselves first. Top 3 issues right now for you that were problematic in that bill.
Yeah, so the number one is really around payment of rewards on stablecoins. I think Americans should be able to earn more money on their money. Banks should have to compete on a level playing field, and if the American people feel like the banks are not paying high enough interest rates and stablecoin rewards can offer them more, then maybe the banks should have to pay higher interest rates to compete, right? I don't think there should be any protectionism.
Do you think that was put in directly for the banks, that was lobbied by the banks and put in?
Yes.
The Genius Act last year banned issuers like Circle from paying interest. But the new Clarity Amendment expanded that ban to everyone. It aims to prohibit crypto exchanges and platforms from passing any yield onto customers simply for holding stablecoins. Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong called this out specifically. He said it was a provision designed to, quote, allow banks to ban their competition.
Yeah, I mean, it's odd that they would want to stop that, actually. I don't know why a regulator or the government would even care if yield is being passed on to the consumer. So I do wonder where, the sort of origin of this particular amendment that was introduced. Why would the government want to stop crypto projects from passing on yield of 4 or 5% or whatever it is, right? And stifle competition, unless there's been lobbying by the banks to do so. But even then, why would they side with the banks? And one has to question, how much influence and how much, I don't want to say collusion, because that's probably an unfair word, but how much influence and clout do banks have when something threatens their position? It's an interesting state of affairs, actually, because it kind of just feels unnecessary in many ways, because it's not a massive win per se, and it's not a massive threat. It's not an insurmountable. It's not an existential threat to the banks, right? So that's why I find the whole thing very, very strange.
And look, the banks argue effectively that the stablecoin market is going to force massive withdrawals that are going to come out of the banks, that it is not an efficient system for credit in America, effectively, because the treasuries that are going to be required to back the stablecoins are not going to be used in the same way. I mean, there are arguments that I think have some validity from the banking system beyond what you think ultimately happens to the banking system and how much you care about the strength or not of it.
Yeah. Well, there is certainly a balance of where should this capital go? I mean, it can go to lending, which is important. It can also go to buying U.S. treasuries, which is also important. And I think that it's essentially going to come down to where can people earn return for the appropriate amount of risk, right? If the Fed lowers interest rates, that would push more people to seeking higher returns from a lending product, right? If they raise interest rates, it's going to keep more money at the Fed. And that's frankly what a lot of banks are doing. They're holding trillions of dollars at the Fed also that's not being lent out. And so I think what we have to realize here is that crypto can provide solutions like rewards and stablecoins. It can also build lending products. Like DeFi lending is growing enormously. Banks can provide that also. And so we should have a level playing field where everyone can compete, clear rules, and everyone can win.
Should you have a level regulatory framework as well? Should you be regulated the very same way the banks are, if that's the plan?
Well, the banks are doing something very different, which is called fractional reserve lending. So they're actually lending out customer deposits without their permission, essentially, right, to earn the spread. And that's what the whole banking, that's why there's such heavy oversight from banking regulation.
What's different in what you're planning on doing with your customers' assets?
So under Genius, stablecoin issuers have to hold 100% reserve. It's not fractional reserve. 100% of the assets are in short-term U.S. treasuries. It's very low risk. It's less risky than holding it in a bank.
The DeFi lending would be coming from what money?
That's customers opting into it. And they can say, all right, I actually want to earn more, so I'm going to put my money into this DeFi protocol, and I can get 6 or 7 or 10% return for some appropriate amount of risk. So it's customers opting into it as opposed to
the banks
doing it behind the scenes.
I don't know.
If this bill were to pass with this provision, then the crypto industry would lose one of its best user acquisition tools, and the banks would maintain their monopoly on interest.
Yeah, and that's true. Like yield that's far higher than an interest rate you would get at the bank would encourage wider adoption. Um, so by removing that feature just for the sake of it, because as I say, it's something that's like it's just a feature of what the blockchain and blockchain projects can do, and you're basically just turning it off through regulation. So by doing that, you're just kind of making it, you're just neutering it, right? You're just nerfing blockchain for some reason. And again, from my perspective, I'm not understanding the logic other than collusion potentially as to why you would do that.
It's a classic case of attempted regulatory capture. And finally, we have the third poison pill, new powers for the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, targeting DeFi. The amendment included language that would force DeFi front ends, the websites you use to interact with, say, Uniswap or Aave, to comply with strict sanctions screening and anti-money laundering rules. Now, on the surface, stopping money laundering sounds good. But in practice, this language was so broad that it could require a decentralized exchange to collect your name, address, and social security number before you could even connect your wallet.
Yeah, and this is the problem. When something is broad, and again, I haven't seen the wording, but if it's very, very broad, in many ways, it doesn't actually give you any clarity. It just tends to mean you kind of overcompensate with the requirement. So again, if there's a requirement here to vet and check any potential clients or customers to make sure that they're not sanctioned persons, for example, you've got enhanced anti-money laundering checks, for example, um, and you're not really clear how far you should take them. What you'll find is that these sort of exchanges will just over collect, so to speak, just to make sure that they remain compliant. And there is already regulation in this space already, right? So, there is the crypto asset reporting framework, which requires a lot of this information to be shared with the government authorities. And we've got MICA regulation, for example, in the UK, in Europe, I should say, which covers a lot of different areas, which again is to address money laundering and knowing your client and making sure that there isn't, blockchain is not being used to avoid taxes, for example. We have travel rules already with many exchanges and custodial services, where again, you need to indicate the source of where crypto has come from and where it's going, and in some cases for what purposes. So a lot of this information is there already, but one of the key tenets of the blockchain and crypto is that it's permissionless, right? It's an idea that, provided you meet some of these requirements or these basic requirements, anyone or anybody can take custody and control and manage their own assets via the blockchain and access them as and when they need them. And there isn't a central authority that can prevent you from doing that, provided you play by the rules of that particular crypto exchange, for example. So it's basically a self-regulated space by virtue of what we call a decentralized consensus, where it's basically those that act as validators across the blockchain agree on what is going on in terms of the record and the truth of transaction and transaction history. And again, those that try and maliciously modify blockchain records, basically, if they're staking their own assets as a validator, what they find is that they get a penalty and they lose some of their stake, and basically it's slashed. So there's a financial penalty for bad faith actors in this space, and that's essentially how a lot of this works. Whilst with a central financial framework, that you're trusting the central party, right? So Coinbase, for example, is a centralized exchange, and you're trusting them to keep a record of your assets and where they are. And basically, if you need to get those assets back, that Coinbase can honor that and give you those assets back. And that's where FTX fell down, for example, where they were trusted to hold a lot of these crypto assets. There was no governance to make sure that those assets were protected. And basically, when they collapsed, a lot of other companies were brought down with them, in particular BlockFi, for example. So that's the risk you have when you're relying on a centralized organization or body to maintain and look after and keep custody of your finances, your money, or any assets, whether they be crypto or otherwise.
It would effectively turn DeFi into CeFi with extra steps. It would kill the privacy and permissionless nature that makes this technology valuable in the first place.
Yeah, and the permissionless element is really, really valuable, right? Privacy, I think is also important, but in many ways, I think it's going to be harder and harder to stay private on the block exchange. And in many ways, as I say, based on a lot of the reporting requirements that exist, it's very, very difficult to view yourself as being anonymous on blockchain. If you're on blockchain, everything you do is known, it can be observed, can be seen. And as I say, what's happening now is a lot of these central exchanges are having to report information they're collecting on you to regulatory authorities for the purposes, for example, of making sure you're not avoiding taxes, for example. So as far as I'm concerned, if you participate on the blockchain, you must assume you are not anonymous. But one of the key tenets that can be preserved is that it's a permissionless infrastructure and framework whereby, you're not prevented from participating in a particular blockchain project, and you're not preventing from withdrawing or accessing your money or your finances or your assets from that same protocol or that same project. There's no government interference. There's no central body preventing you or sanctioning you or doing anything that gets in the way of you and basically what is yours.
You have a bill that seeks to ban tokenized stocks, kill stablecoin yield, and surveil DeFi. And this is...
Yeah, and that's just a terrible situation, right? It's like, what is the actual point? And for me, that's the key thing around blockchain. It's an innovative technology with a lot of potential, and you're basically regulating out a lot of the things it's there to do. So it's a very strange, crazy position as far as I'm concerned.
Where things got interesting. Because despite all of this, some parts of the crypto industry still wanted to push ahead. There was a rush to vote. Leadership in the Senate wanted to jam this bill through before the 2026 midterm election cycle took over. They figured that a bad bill was better than no bill and that they could fix it in post. But one company decided that the price was too high. So, on Tuesday, the 14th of January, less than 24 hours before the markup, Coinbase walked. Brian Armstrong posted a thread on X that effectively nuked the bill. He said, quote, "We'd rather have no bill than a bad bill." And this was the turning point. Now, you have to understand the power dynamics here. Coinbase is the 800-pound gorilla of US crypto lobbying. They have spent millions trying to get regulations passed. So, for them to publicly withdraw support was a massive signal to every Republican on the committee. Armstrong specifically cited the ban on tokenized equities and the stablecoin yield issue.
I mean, one has to wonder, if the bill was passed, what would Coinbase have done? So they can protest, right? And obviously, it is a massive signal because they are literally the biggest crypto exchange probably at the moment. Kraken is pretty big as well, and Ripple is pretty big, but it's not known as an exchange per se, Ripple. But I do wonder actually if the bill had been passed in spite of their objections, what would have Coinbase have done? What power would they even have? So it's interesting that they were actually able to torpedo it, despite the fact that, as I say, in some ways, what would they do if it was actually passed?
He realized that if this bill passed, it would essentially outlaw Coinbase's future business model. But here is where it gets really spicy. The industry was not united. While Coinbase and A16Z were slamming the bill for killing DeFi and privacy, other players like Kraken and Ripple were reportedly trying to salvage it. Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse posted that, quote, "Clarity beats chaos," implying that even a flawed bill was better than the endless lawsuits they've been fighting for years. Kraken's co-CEO Arjun Sethi argued that walking away now would leave American companies in limbo while the rest of the world moves forward. So we had a civil war. On one side, the purists who refused to accept a bill that crippled innovation. On the other side, the pragmatists who were desperate for any kind of legal shield. But in the end, Coinbase's withdrawal was the final nail in the coffin. Why? because the politics didn't add up. To pass this bill, Senator Tim Scott needed 60 votes in the full Senate. That meant he needed bipartisan support. But with the industry split, he lost the cover he needed. Republicans started getting cold feet. They didn't want to vote for a bill that the biggest crypto company in America was calling anti-innovation. They didn't want to be seen as handing a win to the banks at the expense of the crypto industry, especially with a pro-crypto White House watching closely.
So one has to wonder then, if they don't want to be seen as being in the pockets or handing a win to the bank, then why make the amendments that stifled the innovation? Certainly with respect to the point that was raised around passing on yield or paying yield on stablecoin, for example. So expanding that beyond what was in the Genius Act. So why create the problem in the first place would be my question. So it just seems a bit nonsensical in many ways that on the one hand, you don't want to, well, I guess it's perception, right? So maybe they are on the side of the banks, but they just don't want to be seen as being on the side of the banks. Maybe that's what this is, right? Maybe I've answered my own question. Who knows?
While on the Democrat side, you had Senator Elizabeth Warren. Although she wasn't opposing the bill because it was too harsh, she was opposing it because she thought it was too soft. She sent a letter to the SEC just days before warning that the bill didn't do enough to protect consumers from, quote, crypto predation. So you had a situation where the Republicans were bailing because the bill was too strict and the Democrats were bailing because it wasn't strict enough. The center collapsed. On the evening of Wednesday, the 14th of January, the Senate Banking Committee officially announced that the markup was postponed. They didn't say cancelled, they said postponed. But let's be honest, in Washington, a postponement this close to an election year is often a death sentence. So where does that leave us? Well, we're now back in the regulatory vacuum, and the market reaction was immediate. We saw volatility in Bitcoin and Ethereum as traders realized that the regulatory pump wasn't coming. Without the Clarity Act, we're stuck with the status quo. And as much as Brian Armstrong said the bill was worse than the status quo isn't exactly a picnic. It means we could be back to regulation by enforcement. Even with a new administration, the SEC still has the authority to investigate and sue crypto projects. The difference now is that there are no new rules to stop them. The innovation exemption that SEC Chair Paul Atkins proposed is still just a promise. It's not law. And what about the institutions? Remember, the whole point of this bill was to give big money the confidence to enter the market. BlackRock, Fidelity, the pension funds, they all want legislative certainty. With the bill in limbo, likely until after the midterms in November 2026 or even into 2027, that institutional capital might stay on the sidelines a little longer. Or, and here's the cynical take, they might just find a way to do it anyway. Remember the poison pill about banks, the one that allowed them to custody crypto without holding massive reserves? That was in the bill. Now that the bill is stalled, the banks are technically still blocked by SAB 121 rules. So in a weird way, the failure of this bill keeps the banks out of crypto for a bit longer.
Yeah, that SAB rule, I'm assuming it's similar to the Basel rules with respect to certainly the UK, possibly Europe, which again is about how much money a bank has to hold in reserve relative to what it's lending out, essentially. So as I say, with respect to the fact that this act, the Clarity Act, wasn't passed, again, it makes it more difficult for the banks to actually participate in this space. Again, if they're subject to this SAB 121 rule, I think it also be mentioned, or this Basel rule regarding how much they need to have in reserve. So, as I say, that's a good thing in my view, in the sense that it forces banks to be somewhat responsible and not over sort of stretch themselves in terms of borrowing or lending, I should say. So yeah, I think that's good, and you'd hope actually, if the Clarity Act was to pass, that these protections would actually stay there with respect to whatever they're doing in the crypto space. But who knows?
Here is the real lesson from this week. In the rush for clarity, Washington almost codified catastrophe. And the crypto industry proved something important this week. It, or at least some elements of it at least, proved that it has a spine. For years, crypto has been begging for a seat at the table. But when they finally got there and saw what was on the menu, a ban on DeFi, a ban on yield, and a ban on tokenization, they stood up and walked out. That is a sign of maturity. It shows that the industry is powerful enough to kill bad legislation, even if it means waiting longer for good legislation. Now, there is talk of another markup scheduled for the Agriculture Committee on the 27th of January. But let's be real. Without the Banking Committee's support and without a unified industry, that session is looking like a dead man walking. The 2026 midterm elections are looming. The legislative window is closing fast.
Yeah, so this midterm election is definitely going to be something that's going to be at the forefront and is going to take priority over any kind of crypto bill or revisiting the Clarity Act. So when you consider what's going on, unfortunately, with the ICE agents and you know, the removal of suspected immigrants, for example, and what's been happening in terms of, unfortunately, some of the shootings. You know, obviously there's talk around the fact that you know, there may be interference with the midterms and sort of passing on the electoral register to the White House for whatever reason. So clearly that's where the focus is going to be. And obviously there's been a massive fallout in terms of, you know, what's been happening, you know, with respect to Venezuela as well, and also Greenland, and potential tariffs on Canada. So there's definitely a lot on Donald Trump's plate. And I think those things I've just listed there probably feel more important in my mind than you know, clarity with respect to the crypto industry.
If they can't fix the poison pills, if they can't find a way to allow stablecoin yield and tokenized equities, then we might not see a market structure bill until 2027 at the earliest. And do you know what? That might be okay.
Yeah, and I agree. If it's going to be a better bill that serves the interests of consumers, then that's fine, right? I don't have an issue with that either.
Because if the alternative is a law that turns crypto into nothing more than a digital database for the big banks, then maybe the Wild West isn't so bad after all.
And again, this is a philosophical position, right? So what is DeFi if it's just a database, right? What is the point of it, I suppose, would be my question. And it will come back to my original feeling around crypto when I first came across you know, the technology. You know, when it was presented as a currency, in my own mind, you know, again, I was asking the question, like, well, what is the point of this? And it's only when you start understanding it and viewing it as a technology and something that, you know, has features and characteristics that could make it superior, or at least a better alternative than the current traditional finance system we have already, that's when it becomes interesting. So if you start removing those features and it starts becoming more like the traditional finance infrastructure and frameworks we have, then you might as well just stick with the traditional finance frameworks you already have, right? Because, you know, it's a place where compliance requirements are known. It's safer in that regard. There's more regulation, there's more protection, and it's easier, provided you have permission. It's easier to sort of onboard yourself, get a bank account, you know, change bank accounts, etc., etc. So, as I say, you know, a bill that kind of prevents blockchain technology realizing its potential and what it can be and stifles innovation, kind of renders it pointless in many ways, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, so my own view is that, you know, it's a shame because, as I say, my initial feeling around the Clarity Act was that it was going to be a good thing. Obviously, I wasn't aware at the time I covered it initially about these amendments, which obviously came through very last minute. I don't think anybody was. Certainly Coinbase wasn't. So therefore, when their lawyers, as the presenter mentioned it here, looked through it, clearly the problems were very, very significant. They're very, you know, they're ultimately insurmountable. And therefore they publicly, you know, declared their opposition to the bill, which meant obviously that bipartisan support fell away. And I think ultimately, from my perspective, that's a good thing, right? And I think it is good that, you know, you do have this internal challenge within the crypto industry. So as I say, I think it's healthy, the fact that the crypto industry isn't fully aligned, i.e. Kraken has a different position, Ripple has a different position. And I think to me, it shows the health of the crypto space as well, because all of their technologies and their offerings are trying to address different problems in this space with respect to finance. So therefore, we would expect them to have a different position. And ultimately, we've landed in a space where actually an act, in my view, which I would deem as bad based on the interpretation that's been given here, has been torpedoed and has not gone through, and is going to have to be revisited if Coinbase are going to get behind it. So I think that's a good thing ultimately. But broadly speaking, I think it's encouraging that crypto is being taken more seriously, implicitly, by governments and by regulatory authorities and by banking regulation as well. So obviously it's come under the scope of the SEC, and the CFTC as well. And I think that is the right thing to do. So whether there's regulation or not, I think that oversight should exist. But the key thing is that the regulation shouldn't get in the way of innovation. And I think for me that rings true of any type of regulation you think of. It shouldn't stifle competition and it shouldn't stifle innovation, because if it does, the victims, the people that will harm, it will be the consumer, it will be the retail investor, the likes of you and me. And I think for me that's why it's important that any regulation is for the benefit ultimately of us, of people like us, rather than old money institution banks, where again a lot of the value that they're creating is not passed on to the consumer, who are giving them a lot of their money and their deposits. So yeah, that's my own view around this. But let me know what you think in the comments. But until next time, peace.